So now the American Revolution is over. America is on its own. Try to imagine if you were 18 and you suddenly decided you didn't want to live with your parents anymore. You wanted to be on your own. You were a grown up. Well, I guess that could happen. But if you decide to go down that road, right, there are a lot of consequences to that choice. Like who's going to pay for your cell phone? How are you going to get a haircut? Who's going to buy your Burger King for you? So when America decides we want to be on our own, we fight a revolution to prove it. We declare our independence, and we actually win thanks to the French. It's an amazing moment in history of the world, really. It had never been done before. But now we are on our own. And it's one thing to say you want to be a grown-up. It's something else to actually be a grown-up and be in charge of every decision you make. So we talked about the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And you guys remember we actually had earlier in the year another Treaty of Paris of 1763. That ended the French-Indian War. And in that treaty, the French were humiliated and the British were on top. Fast forward 20 years later, the Treaty of Paris of 1783, it's the exact opposite. The French and the Americans can gloat where the British are humiliated. The most powerful country in the world had been defeated by a brand new upstart country with 13 different little states, each kind of doing their own thing, along with the help of the number two power in Europe, France. So the Treaty of Paris marks the end of the war, and this painting that you're looking at now is an actual painting from an art museum where you could go and see kind of a depiction of the signing of the Treaty of Paris. So on the left-hand side, you see the American delegation. You see Ben Franklin there in the black jacket, John Adams next to him to the left of Ben Franklin, and standing up is John Jay. These are the three Americans. And when they set for this painting, remember, this is not like taking a selfie. A painting takes a while. And so you can see that the painting is not finished. Well, the Americans were super eager to sit and to enjoy the victory that they had achieved in the American Revolution. However, the British, as you can see, didn't stick around for the painting. So the two people to the right, no, that's not George Washington, those are British people. They got in, they signed it, and they got out of Paris as quickly as they could. They were humiliated. They would not sit for the painting, which might take a few hours for the artist to kind of sketch it and begin to paint it. So this is the way the painting looks in an art museum today. It's a reminder that the British weren't too happy about losing, whereas the Americans and the French wanted this moment to go on because it was a great time for them to reflect on how they had just defeated the most powerful country in the world. But now America is on its own. And really one of the first things that America has to decide is what will this country look like? What will our new government be? All of these states, these 13 states, they're all very different. How will this new nation look? So that brings us to a really important distinction that we have to get in our brain. A confederation is really one of the options, which a confederation would be states that are just friends, casual acquaintances. They might hang out together once in a while, but they're not committed to each other totally. Whereas a union is more of a marriage, meaning everybody is joined. The finances are connected. They're all extremely connected to each other, tied to each other. So America has to decide early on after the war, what kind of country are we going to be? Are we going to be a confederation where everyone's kind of just friends, all the states are friends, or are we going to be something more? The problem with the Union, at least at the end of the American Revolution, is that most of the states weren't ready for that. Maryland did not want to marry New Hampshire. They didn't have a lot in common. And Georgia didn't want to marry Rhode Island and vice versa. They were all friends, but they just weren't that much alike. And they didn't think that a marriage, a union, would work. So our first attempt at government, our first try at a new federal government, remember the states all had their own government, but a our first try at a national government is based on this idea of a confederation. A confederation is just a group of friends, a group of states that are kind of casual. They're connected somewhat, but they're totally not married. So that brings us to our first try of government. And yes, it's a fancy yellow piece of paper. It's crusty. It's basically, they wrote down our federal government and they called it the Articles of Confederation. So an articles would just be newspaper or anything that's written, right? So this is our written form of government based on the idea that the states are just friends, casual, confederation. So from now on, we'll just call it the AOC just to save a little time. The AOC was our first try at government, right? It was the first rule book of the United States. And it goes from 1781 to 1789. So not around for a long time. It's our first try. So we don't really know what we're doing, but we know we didn't really want a strong federal government. All of the 13 states agreed to that. They were nervous about a strong federal government with a leader like a king who could become a tyrant. So they tried to avoid that. I mean, each state had their own governor, and they had their own lawmaking group in their state. And for them, that was pretty much enough. North Carolina did their own thing. They had a governor, they had their legislature, they made their own rules. And sure, they were friends with Connecticut, but they certainly weren't married to Connecticut. And under this Articles of Confederation, this Congress would meet, right? They had a federal government. They would have a Congress, and the Congress would actually meet in various locations, not just in Philadelphia. It would meet sometimes in New Jersey. They met for a while at Princeton University in New Jersey. They would meet maybe at the State House in Maryland, the Annapolis State House in Maryland. They met at different locations, but it was only a Congress, okay? Only a Congress. And the Congress didn't have a lot of power. But each state would get one vote in this new Congress. So, say, New York might send 7 reps, but they would only be able to have one vote. So those 7 reps would have to figure out how New York would vote. Rhode Island might send 3 reps, but Rhode Island would only have one vote. The idea in this Congress under the Articles of Confederation was that every state was equal, which I want you to think about whether that's fair or not. This is something we're going to be talking about for a while. If every state is equal, whether it's Rhode Island or New York or Virginia, even the small states have just as much say as the big states. Of course, the small states love this. The big states, they don't think it's fair. They have more people. They should have more say in the government. But again, not many people really cared much about the Articles of Confederation and the Congress. It wasn't like today. The Congress back then was just very casual. It was based on a confederation. They met once in a while, but nothing was really done. They could, however, declare war, which they never did. They could, this new Congress, raise an army, which they never needed to. They could print money, which is weird, right? Because every colony had their own money. So that's 13 different types of money now, plus a new national money meant 14 different types of money floating around. So if you lived in New Jersey, would you accept Virginia money? Would you even accept the new national money in New Jersey? So there's a lot of questions. Again, we're brand new at this. We really don't know what we're doing. We're trying out this idea of a confederation. They also could deliver mail. They thought having a postal system was extremely important to the country, which it was and it still is. So the Articles of Confederation the AOC were our first try. They weren't super successful. There were a lot of weaknesses. You probably already noticed that they didn't have a president under the AOC. They were scared of a strong president. They didn't want one. They didn't have a Supreme Court. They had seen the British courts in action. They didn't really want a strong court that could throw people in jail or overturn any kind of rules that were made in the states. And the federal government under the AOC could not tax. Remember, the colonists had been taxed too much, in their opinion, and they didn't want to give that power to the new federal government. States could tax, but not the federal government. So you can see there were a lot of problems with the AOC. But it reflects the way the colonists were thinking, the way that these new states were thinking. They were worried about a president being too strong and powerful. They were worried about a Supreme Court being too strong and powerful. And they were worried about a federal government taxing them into oblivion. So they did not put that in their first run at government. Again, today, if you think about if there were riots in the streets or people didn't want to follow the law, the president or the people who work for the president, whether it's the FBI or the military or whoever, would help enforce the law. There were no federal law enforcement components to the Articles of Confederation. There was no president to make sure the laws were followed. There was no Supreme Court, and there were no taxes. Without taxes, how are you? New territory to the United States beyond the 13 original states. So when the United States wins the war against the British, they take the British territory basically all the way to the Mississippi River. How they will handle that territory, how they will set it up, how will they give it away or sell it, what will the rules be in the new land, how will the 13 original colony residents be able to spread out to that new territory. That's all part of the Northwest Territory and the laws for that territory called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So that would be a strength, one important thing that they were able to do under the Articles of Confederation. If I show you this map of the Northwest Territory, you see basically it's our neighborhood, right? It's kind of the Great Lakes region. This was the Northwest Territory. And this is what there are lots of weaknesses in our first try at government, but they did handle the new territory in an organized way and allowed these new regions to get organized and to eventually join the country as states a little bit later on down the road. So the Northwest Territory, I want you to kind of look at it, think about this region, and I want you to think about doing some book work. So I'll be posting in another folder inside this week's folder and early next week's folder, or the folder for next week, I should say, some book work using some pages out of the book and answering some vocabulary dealing with the Articles of Confederation. There it is on the left, that crusty yellow piece of paper, and the strengths and weaknesses, including the Northwest Territory. So make sure you check that out and have those ready to go for a class.